Imagine everything around you, the chair you're sitting on, the device you're watching this on, the very room you're in, is nothing but an elaborate illusion being fed into your brain. Sounds like a bad sci-fi movie, right? But it's a real philosophical nightmare scenario. What if you're just a brain in a vat, living in a simulated reality? If that idea makes your head spin, you're not alone. Philosophers, scientists, and sci-fi writers have been obsessing over this for centuries. Today, we're going to dig deep into the brain in a vat concept, from its dusty philosophical origins to cutting-edge neuroscience labs, and from Descartes to the Matrix. Buckle up for a wild ride through reality, illusion, and everything in between. Let's jump into that hair hole, because I've already finished with rabbit ones. Our story begins in the 17th century with a French philosopher having an existential crisis. René Descartes, the I think therefore I am guy, was trying to figure out what he could know for certain. He imagined that a powerful malicious demon was tricking him at every turn, feeding his senses nothing but lies. Maybe the entire external world was a deception orchestrated by this demon. Descartes wondered, if an evil genius can control all my experiences, how can I trust anything I see or feel? This was Descartes' dramatic way of asking, how do I know what's real? Fast forward to the 20th century. Philosophers updated Descartes' creepy demon to a more high-tech scenario. Enter the brain in a vat. In this thought experiment, a mad scientist, because of course, kidnaps you, pops out your brain, and plunks it into a jar of life-sustaining goo. Then they hook up your brain's neurons to a supercomputer that feeds you electrical impulses identical to what you'd normally get from your eyes, ears, skin, etc. If the simulation is perfect, your disembodied brain would continue to have totally normal, conscious experiences. Blissfully unaware it's a lab specimen on some maniac's shelf. In other words, your brain could be fooled into anything when fed the appropriate stimuli. It would feel like you're living your everyday life, while in reality you're a wet, naked brain floating in a vat. Yikes. This scenario didn't pop out of nowhere. It was hinted at by various philosophers, but it was Hilary Putnam in 1981 who made the brain in a vat thought experiment famous in modern philosophy. Putnam basically asked, if you were a brain in a vat, getting all the same inputs you normally get, how could you possibly know? You couldn't. From inside your mind, it would all seem normal. This makes brain in a vat the ultimate skeptical hypothesis. It's a lot like the plot of The Matrix, where human brains, still in skulls but plugged into vats of goo, live in a simulated world without knowing it. In fact, the Matrix filmmakers were clearly inspired by this very idea. They just added Kung Fu and Keanu Reeves for good measure. So the big freakout here is an epistemological one. Epistemology to our theory of knowledge. If you were a brain in a vat, all your perceptions would be exactly the same as they are now. As far as you, the brain, can tell, nothing is amiss. You taste the coffee, feel the warmth of your mug, hear the intro music of this video, it all seems real. Therefore, as the classic argument goes, you can't be sure that you're not just a brain in a vat, since any evidence you find could be part of the fake simulation. If we can't rule it out, does that mean we know anything for sure? Hello, philosophical skepticism. This is the kind of thing that keeps philosophers up at night. Before you resign yourself to existential dread, though, Putnam had a cheeky twist. He argued that the statement, I am a brain in a vat, would be either false or meaningless if it were actually true. Huh? Here's a very simplified way to get it. If you've always been just a brain in a lab, when you say vat or brain, you're referring to things within your simulation, not real brains or real vats. So you wouldn't be correctly referring to the actual situation. It's a bit of semantic mind-bending. You, the poor and vatted brain, can't truly conceive of the real vat you're in, so you can't meaningfully say, I'm a brain in a vat. Therefore, that sentence can't be a truthful statement you can make. Putnam basically tried to logic his way out of the nightmare. Either I'm not a brain in a vat, or if I am, I can't meaningfully say I am. So the whole scenario is no threat to what I think I know. Convenient? Maybe. Clever? Absolutely. But not everyone finds that comforting. After all, even if the words are meaningless to the brain in the vat, it's still experientially stuck in La La Land. The core fear remains that there's an unbridgeable gap between our experiences and reality. Descartes at least found one thing to hold on to. Demon or no demon, if he's doubting and thinking, then he exists as a mind. I think therefore I am. A brain in a vat could say the same. I think so I must exist as something. But beyond that, everything else could be illusion. This is deep skepticism in action. The brain in a vat scenario forces us to grapple with a big question: what can we truly know? If our senses are deceivable, is there any way to prove that the world is real? This isn't just stoner talk or late-night dorm room philosophy. It's a question that has shaped entire schools of thought. Philosophers categorize this under skeptical arguments and epistemology, basically questioning the limits of knowledge. The vat brain is a modern riff on an age-old problem. Variations of it go back to ancient times. For example, in ancient China, Zhuangzi told a story of a man who dreamed he was a butterfly, then woke up unsure if he was actually a butterfly dreaming he was a man. Sounds whimsical, but it's the same idea. How do you know your reality is the reality? At its heart, the brain in a vat thought experiment says, if the brain gets the same inputs, it doesn't matter where those inputs come from, you'll have the same experience. It's like running a program on a different computer. If the inputs and code are identical, the output is identical. You, or your brain, cannot tell the difference. So you could be walking down the street, feeling the pavement under your feet, when in fact you're a cortex in a jar getting jolts of electricity that perfectly emulate walking down the street signals. There is literally no test you, from inside your mind, can do to catch the deception. Any glitch you notice could just be another part of the simulation script. This naturally leads to solipsism, the extreme philosophical position that only your mind is sure to exist. If you can't trust the external world, maybe the safest bet is that nothing exists outside of your own thoughts. The brain in a vat scenario is like solipsism's high-tech cousin. Maybe other minds and a physical world exist, but not in the form you think. It could all be an elaborate VR. Either way, you're left radically alone with your perceptions. That's a pretty lonely thought, and a great premise for existential horror stories, by the way. Now let's bring this into the 21st century with the simulation hypothesis. You've probably heard this one. The idea, popularized by philosopher Nick Bostrom and oddly endorsed by various tech billionaires, that our reality might be a sophisticated computer simulation. If future or alien civilizations can run insanely detailed simulations of universes with conscious beings, how do we know we're not inside one of those? This is basically brain in a vat without the biological brain. Instead of a mad scientist with a jar, you have a super advanced computer running ancestor simulation software. We wouldn't necessarily be wet brains in goo, we could be purely digital minds in a simulated environment. But from the inside, it's the same predicament. We can't tell. Bostrom's argument famously suggests that at least one of the following is true. At first, almost no civilization reaches a technological level to run such sims. They go extinct or lose interest. For the second, such sims are possible but no one actually runs them at large scale. Or third, we're almost certainly in a simulation right now. A lot of people have jumped on this simulation train. It's been in the zeitgeist, even making it to mainstream debates and plenty of pop culture. Unlike the old brain in vat story, which started as a skeptical thought experiment, how do we know anything? The simulation hypothesis isn't assuming we're being deceived. It's trying to reason out probabilistically whether it's likely we're living in base reality or not. It's a subtle difference in approach, but to you and me living our lives, it boils down to the same unsettling possibility. The world might not be what we think it is. There's an interesting nuance here. Some philosophers, like David Chalmers, have pointed out that if we were in a perfect simulation, it might not actually negate the reality of our experiences. If the simulation is consistent and law-abiding, then the objects and people we interact with do exist, just on a different substrate. They're real within the simulated universe, kind of like how virtual particles in a video game are real to the game world. So Chalmers would say, maybe being in a simulation is not as disastrous for knowledge as Descartes' demon scenario. In The Matrix, Morpheus treats the Matrix world as totally false, desert of the real and all, but Chalmers says it's a form of reality, just not the one you think. That's a more optimistic spin. Even if we're in a vat or a sim, what we see still has some reality, just virtual reality. It's like saying, sure, I'm a brain in a vat, but these vat-generated tacos still taste pretty good, so who cares if they're not made of atoms? Not everyone is sold on that optimism, though. There are also arguments about whether a brain could even have a normal mind with no body at all. Some thinkers argue that minds are inherently embodied, that our bodily sensations, our hormones, our interactions with a physical environment shape consciousness in a way you can't just replicate with disembodied neurons. According to this view, a vat brain might go insane or comatose without a body, or it might never develop consciousness properly in the first place, if it started out vat-grown because it lacks the feedback systems of a biological organism. It's a compelling point. Your brain is part of a whole ecosystem called your body. Take it out of that, and who knows if it functions the same. The counter to that argument is, again, to imagine our hypothetical evil genius scientist is really on the ball. Maybe they also simulate all the hormonal drips and somatic feedback a brain would get from a body. If you manage to reproduce everything, down to the feeling of a pit in your stomach when you're nervous, the rush of adrenaline, etc., then perhaps the brain truly wouldn't know the difference. In theory, an almighty simulation could include a virtual body for the brain, so when you move your virtual arm, the computer feeds the brain the exact signals that having an arm would produce. This is getting very Inception level layered, but it shows how tricky the details can get. At this point, you might be thinking, okay fine, it's philosophically possible I'm a brain in a vat or a sim, but come on, isn't that a bit far-fetched? Has anything even remotely like this ever happened outside of philosophy class? Great question. Let's leave the armchair and head to the laboratory, or sometimes the mad scientist's basement, to see what science has to say.